The afternoon air inside the upscale Korean restaurant was thick with the aroma of ginger, toasted sesame, and simmering bone broth. It was a world of polished wood and soft music, a sharp contrast to the biting wind Esther and little Zion had just escaped. Esther's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted the collar of her weathered jacket, her fingers brushing against Zion's bright yellow dress, a splash of defiant color against their gray reality. They stood at the mahogany counter, looking like ghosts in a room full of people celebrating life. Esther swallowed hard, her throat dry from hours of silence. She looked at Stella, the young waitress whose apron was crisp and whose eyes were filled with the impatient glow of someone who had never known a day of true hunger. "Excuse me," Esther whispered, her voice barely rising above the hum of the kitchen. "I was wondering, do you maybe have any leftover soup? Just some broth or scraps you were going to throw away? My daughter hasn't eaten since yesterday morning." Stella didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned back, her lips curling into a slow, cruel smile. Behind her, the lead waitress in the green apron adjusted her glasses, her gaze scanning Esther's faded hoodie with clinical detachment. Then, the sound broke the silence, a sharp, melodic laugh that cut through the room like a blade. "Leftover soup?" Stella repeated, her voice loud enough to make the nearby diners pause their conversations. "This is a five-star establishment, not a charity ward. We don't give trash to customers." A few patrons at a corner table snickered under their breath, watching the spectacle of a woman begging for scraps. Zion looked up, her large, attentive eyes moving from the mocking waitress to her mother's pale face. She felt the grip on her hand tighten. The little girl lowered her head, the weight of the rejection pulling at her small shoulders. Esther blinked rapidly, fighting the hot sting of tears that threatened to spill over. She felt the familiar crush of invisibility, the world's way of saying they didn't matter. "Please," Esther tried again, her dignity fraying at the edges. "Just a small bowl for the child." Stella rolled her eyes and sighed with theatrical impatience. "I think you should leave before I call security," she snapped, turning her back to reorganize a stack of menus. But as Esther turned to lead Zion back into the cold, the heavy glass door of the restaurant opened softly. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the air growing heavy and still. A man in a sharp black suit stepped inside, his presence radiating an unyielding authority that made the laughter in the room die in an instant. It was LinHu, and he had heard every word. The silence that followed LinHu's entrance was not the absence of sound, but a heavy, physical presence that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. The clinking of silverware ceased, and the low hum of the air conditioner suddenly felt like a roar in the vacuum of the restaurant. Stella, her back still turned, sensed the shift and froze. When she slowly turned around, the mocking smirk on her face withered like a leaf in a furnace. LinHu did not yell. He did not move with the hurried aggression of a street thug. He moved with the terrifying grace of a predator that knew it was at the top of the food chain. His polished black shoes clicked rhythmically against the marble floor, the sound echoing like a ticking clock. Every eye in the room followed him, the wealthy diners suddenly looked small, and the staff stood as still as statues. He stopped just inches from Esther. Up close, he was a mountain of tailored wool and cold, focused energy. Esther instinctively pulled Zion closer, her heart hammering against her ribs, but LinHu didn't even glance at her yet. His dark, unreadable eyes were fixed entirely on Stella. "Is there a problem with the service?" LinHu asked. His voice was a low, melodic baritone, yet it held a jagged edge that made the lead waitress in the green apron tremble. Stella fumbled with her order pad, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. "And no, Mr. Lin. She was asking for leftovers, and I told her." "I heard what you told her," LinHu interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. "You spoke of trash. You laughed while a child stood hungry in a house of plenty." He stepped closer, forcing Stella to lean back against the counter until she could go no further. The power he radiated was suffocating. He reached out a hand, and for a terrifying second, the room held its breath, expecting violence. Instead, he adjusted the lapel of his suit and looked toward the kitchen. This restaurant exists because I allow it to exist, he said quietly, his gaze now sweeping over the lead waitress and the manager who had finally emerged from the back. The laughter ends now. From this moment, this woman and her daughter are my personal guests. If I hear so much as a whisper of disrespect, or if the soup served is anything less than the best in this kitchen, I will ensure this five-star establishment becomes a vacant lot by sunrise. He finally turned to Esther. The ice in his eyes didn't melt, but it softened into something resembling a grim, distant respect. He looked down at Zion's yellow dress, then back at the mother. Sit, he commanded, gesturing to the most prominent table in the center of the room. Today, you do not beg. Today, you are served. The transition was instantaneous. At a single, sharp nod from LinHu, the restaurant shifted from a frozen tableau into a blur of frantic activity. The manager, bowing so low his forehead nearly brushed the counter, personally led Esther and Zion to the center table, a prime velvet-seated booth usually reserved for dignitaries. Esther moved like a sleepwalker, her hand still white-knuckled around Zion's, terrified that if she breathed too loudly, the dream would shatter and the cold wind would return. LinHu sat across from them, his presence a silent, ironclad perimeter that kept the rest of the world at bay. He didn't look at the menu. He looked at the chef, who had sprinted from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a clean white apron. Bring the royal galbi-tang, LinHu commanded, his voice quiet but Brooklyn tough. The tenderest cuts of beef. The golden broth. And side dishes, everything. If the child's plate is ever empty, I will consider it a personal insult. Within minutes, the table was transformed. Steam rose in fragrant plumes from a heavy stone bowl, the scent of slow-simmered beef and medicinal herbs filling Zion's senses. There were small porcelain dishes of sweet glazed potatoes, crisp kimchi, and delicate egg rolls. It was more food than the little girl had seen in her entire life. Zion looked at the feast, then up at LinHu. Her large, dark eyes were wide with wonder, reflecting the soft amber glow of the restaurant's chandeliers. Is this for me? She whispered, her voice tiny and trembling. LinHu's expression didn't break into a smile, but the harsh lines around his mouth softened. He picked up a pair of polished silver chopsticks and set them beside her bowl. It is all for you, he said. Eat. A princess should never be hungry on a Tuesday. Zion didn't wait. She took a spoonful of the golden broth, and as the warmth hit her, her eyes lit up with a brilliance that seemed to outshine the room. A small, genuine sigh of contentment escaped her lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that Esther hadn't heard in years. Across the table, LinHu watched her. He didn't touch his own tea. To the world, he was a man of stone and shadow, but in the reflection of Zion's delight, a flicker of something long buried began to stir. He watched the way she savored every bite, and for the first time in a decade, the cold vacuum in his chest felt a little less empty. He wasn't just feeding a child, he was atoning for a hunger he had never been able to forget. As Zion remained lost in the wonder of her feast, the clatter of the restaurant seemed to drift into a distant hum, leaving a pocket of heavy, shared silence at the table. Esther watched her daughter with a mixture of relief and lingering fear, her hands still trembling as she toyed with the edge of her napkin. She glanced up at LinHu, finding him not looking at her, but at the empty space where his own meal should have been. Why are you doing this? Esther asked, her voice a fragile thread of sound. A man like you, people say your name and the room goes cold. Why do you care about a bowl of soup for a stranger? LinHu remained still for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from the royal galbi-tang. When he spoke, his voice lacked its usual edge of iron, it was hollow, echoing with a resonance that felt decades old. 30 years ago, I stood on a street corner in Incheon, he began, his eyes dark and distant. The wind was so cold it felt like glass cutting through my skin. I was younger than your daughter is now. I walked into a place much like this one, not because I had money, but because the smell of the broth was the only thing keeping me upright. He finally looked at Esther, and for the first time, she didn't see the mafia boss, she saw the ghost of the boy he had been. I asked the man at the counter for the water from the rice pots. Just the starchy water they usually poured down the drain. he didn't just say no. He kicked me out into the snow and told me that dogs shouldn't beg where men eat. LinHu's hand tightened on the table, the silk of his suit sleeve straining against his arm. I spent that night huddled under a bridge, listening to my stomach scream. I promised myself that if I ever survived that winter, I would build a world where no one would ever have the power to say no to me again. He looked back at Zion, who was currently giggling at a piece of glazed potato that had slipped from her spoon. I became a monster so that I would never be that boy again. But today, when I heard that waitress laugh, I didn't see a homeless woman and a child. I saw that boy in the snow. And I realized that all the power in the city doesn't mean anything if I let that laugh win. The vulnerability was brief, a flicker of light in a dark room before the shutters were pulled closed again. LinHu straightened his tie, his face returning to its unreadable mask of stone. The hunger doesn't just go away, Esther. It stays in your bones. But tonight, you will sleep in a place where the wind cannot find you. The black sedan glided through the rain-slicked streets of the city like a silent shark through deep water. Inside, the leather was cool and smelled of expensive tobacco and cedar, a scent that felt worlds away from the damp concrete Esther and Zion had called home. Zion had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep against Esther's side, her stomach full for the first time in memory, but Esther remained wide awake, watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows. They pulled into the subterranean garage of a towering spire of steel and glass that pierced the night sky. LinHu stepped out first, his movements precise and alert. As the heavy steel gates hissed shut behind them, Esther felt a strange shiver. This wasn't just a building, it was a fortress. "This is the Dragon's Reach," LinHu said, his voice echoing off the concrete pillars. "My personal residence. The top 3 floors are off-limits to everyone but those I trust. Which, currently, is very few people." They took a private elevator that required a biometric scan. As they ascended, the pressure changed in Esther's ears. When the doors finally slid open, she gasped. The apartment was vast, an open-concept marvel of marble and minimalist design, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying view of the glowing metropolis below. It was beautiful, yet there was a coldness to it, a clinical precision that reminded her exactly who their benefactor was. On every table and near every doorway, Esther noticed discreet black consoles and blinking security lights. In the corners of the ceiling, small, silent cameras tracked their movement. Through a half-open door in the hallway, she caught a glimpse of a room filled with monitors displaying every angle of the street below, manned by a man in a tactical vest who nodded wordlessly as LinHu passed. "There are fresh clothes in the guest suite," LinHu remarked, gesturing toward a hallway bathed in soft, recessed lighting. "The fridge is stocked. The locks are reinforced titanium. You are safe here, Esther." Safe, she thought, looking at the heavy reinforced door they had just walked through. She looked at Zion, still cradled in her arms, and then at the silent, powerful man standing by the window, silhouetted against the city he ruled. She was no longer in the wind, but she realized she had traded the dangers of the street for the dangers of a throne. The luxury felt like a velvet glove, but underneath, she could feel the cold, hard steel of the world LinHu inhabited. Here, even the peace felt like it was standing on the edge of a knife. In a dimly lit boardroom across the city, the air was thick with the smell of expensive cigars and the cold hum of high-end servers. Wall-to-wall monitors cast a flickering blue light over the face of a man whose scars told a much darker story than LinHu's. This was Kong, the leader of the Black Viper Syndicate, a man who viewed mercy as a terminal illness. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched a grainy, high-angle playback of the restaurant's security feed. On the screen, LinHu, the man who had spent a decade systematically dismantling Kang's drug routes, was draped in the soft light of a dining booth. He wasn't holding a weapon or signing a death warrant. He was watching a little girl in a yellow dress eat a bowl of soup. A jagged, dry laugh rattled in Kang's chest. "So, the dragon finally grew a heart," he whispered, the sound like sandpaper on stone. "And here I thought he was made of nothing but ice and ambition." He tapped a key, freezing the frame on Esther's face as she looked at LinHu with a mixture of terror and budding hope. To Kong, that look wasn't a sign of peace, it was a beacon. For years, LinHu had been untouchable because he had nothing to lose. He was a ghost who lived in a fortress, a man with no family, no lovers, and no soft spots to exploit. He had been a perfect machine of war. He thinks he's found a sanctuary, Kong sneered, turning to the shadowy figures standing at the edge of the room. He thinks he can bring the scent of the street into his palace and call it a family. He's forgotten the first rule of our world: anything you love is just a handle for your enemy to pull. Kong stood up, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the screens. He walked over to the monitor, tracing the outline of Zion's small silhouette with a gloved finger. The dragon's reach is a fortress against armies, but it wasn't built to protect a mother and a child. Every time he looks at them, he'll be distracted. Every time they breathe, he'll be vulnerable. He turned to his lead enforcer, his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. Send word to the sleepers near the tower. I don't want them dead yet. I want LinHu to feel the weight of what he's taken on. I want him to realize that by saving 2 lives, he signed the death warrants for everyone in that building. Let the dragon play house. We'll be the ones to burn it down. As the monitors flickered, showing Esther and Zion entering the elevator of the glass fortress, Kang's smile widened. The game had changed. The most dangerous man in the city had just given his enemies a target, and the hunt was about to begin. The following evening, the cold geometry of the glass fortress was momentarily softened by the flickering glow of 8 small candles. They stood tall in a simple white cake that the head chef had delivered with a bow that bordered on reverence. Zion sat at the massive marble island, her face illuminated by the dancing flames, her eyes wide with a joy so pure it seemed to vibrate in the still air of the apartment. Esther stood behind her, her hands resting on her daughter's shoulders, feeling the warmth of the moment seep through the layers of her weary soul. Make a wish, Zion, Esther whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Zion closed her eyes tight, her small hands clasped beneath her chin. For a moment, the cameras, the silent guards, and the looming shadows of the city outside didn't exist. There was only the scent of vanilla and the soft hum of the building's ventilation. LinHu stood a few feet away, leaning against the window frame. He was still in his suit, but he had loosened his tie, a rare concession to the domesticity of the scene. He watched the child with a steady, unreadable gaze, though his hand remained habitually near the inner pocket of his jacket. Seeing Zion blow out the candles, a small puff of smoke rising toward the high ceiling, brought a ghost of a memory to his mind, a birthday he had spent alone, sharing a stolen candy bar with a stray dog. The moment of peace was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic vibration. LinHu's phone buzzed against his thigh, 3 short, aggressive bursts. It was a sequence that bypassed all silent modes, a high-priority override reserved for only one thing. He pulled the device from his pocket, the blue light of the screen reflecting off the obsidian sharpness of his eyes. A single line of text glowed on the display, code red: perimeter breach at sublevel 2. Below the text was a live thumbnail of the garage entrance. The heavy steel gates he had trusted were being bypassed, not with explosives, but with an encrypted override code that only his inner circle should have known. Shadowy figures in tactical gear were spilling from a nondescript van, their movements synchronized and lethal. LinHu didn't move, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The moral outlaw vanished, replaced instantly by the warlord of the Dragon's Reach. He looked at Esther, who had frozen at the sight of his face, the cake knife still in her hand. The party is over, LinHu said, his voice flat and cold as a winter grave. He reached into a hidden compartment beneath the marble counter and pulled out a sleek, black handset. Esther, take Zion to the panic room behind the library. Do not lock the door until I am inside. Move. Now. As the distant, muffled sound of a security alarm began to wail through the floorboards, Zion's birthday wish was silenced by the cold reality of the war they had invited through the door. The silence that followed the alarm was more unnerving than the siren itself. LinHu stood in the center of the command suite, his eyes fixed on a wall of monitors that were flicking to static one by one. Down in the lobby, the elite security team he had paid millions to maintain had simply vanished. There were no signs of a struggle, no spent shell casings, only the eerie sight of half-finished coffee cups and abandoned monitors. They didn't break in, LinHu muttered, his jaw tightening until the muscle pulsed. They were invited. The betrayal tasted like copper in his mouth. Kong had managed to buy the one thing LinHu thought was ironclad, the loyalty of his own men. Esther stood by the library door, her breath coming in shallow hitches as she pulled Zion against her legs. The little girl was clutching a small stuffed rabbit, her eyes darting toward the ceiling as the lights overhead flickered and then died, plunged into the sickly red glow of the emergency backups. A soft ding echoed through the apartment, a sound that usually signaled a peaceful arrival. Now, it sounded like a funeral knell. LinHu checked the single functioning monitor near the private lift. The numbers were climbing. Sublevel 2. Lobby. Floor 10. Floor 20. The elevator was bypassing every security lockout he had programmed, moving with a relentless, mechanical purpose toward the penthouse. The panic room, Esther. Now. LinHu's voice was no longer a suggestion, it was a roar of command that shook the glass walls. He didn't wait to see her move. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, kicking aside a designer chair to reach a hidden wall panel. With a fluid, practiced motion, he punched in a code, and the wood paneling slid back to reveal a rack of matte black hardware. He grabbed a submachine gun and checked the chamber, the metallic clack-clack of the bolt being pulled back providing the only rhythm to the impending chaos. He looked at the elevator display. Floor 45. They were seconds away. He could almost feel the weight of the men inside the lift, men who knew the layout of his home, men he had trained, now coming to collect the price of his sudden weakness. He glanced toward the library and saw the heavy steel door of the panic room finally beginning to hiss shut, catching a final glimpse of Zion's yellow dress before she was sealed away. LinHu took a position behind the marble kitchen island, the very place where Zion had blown out her candles moments ago. He braced his weapon against the cold stone, his eyes locked on the elevator doors. The cables groaned, the motor whined, and the floor numbers turned a steady, bloody crimson as the lift reached the top. The hunt had reached his doorstep, and the dragon was finished playing house. The heavy steel door of the panic room hadn't fully sealed when LinHu's hand shot out, blocking the sensor. The door hissed open again, revealing Esther huddled on the floor, her arms wrapped around a trembling Zion. The red emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows across her face, highlighting the raw terror in her eyes. But as LinHu looked at her, he didn't see a victim, he saw a mother whose protective instincts were screaming louder than the sirens. LinHu reached into the small of his back and pulled out a secondary sidearm, a compact, matte black pistol. He knelt in the doorway, the movement fluid despite the chaos. Esther recoiled at first, her eyes fixed on the cold steel. "I can't," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I've never. I don't know how." LinHu's hand was steady, his fingers firm as he gripped her wrist and pressed the weapon into her palm. The metal was heavy and cold, a startling weight that seemed to ground her. "The men coming up that elevator don't care that you've never held a gun," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through her panic. "They are coming for the only thing you have left. They are coming for Zion." At the mention of her daughter's name, Esther's breathing hitched. She looked down at Zion, who was staring at the weapon with wide, uncomprehending eyes. In that moment, something shifted deep within Esther. The tiredness that had carved lines into her face for years, the fatigue of being pushed aside and mocked, suddenly fused into a sharp, jagged spark of defiance. Pointed at the door, LinHu commanded, his eyes boring into hers. "If anyone who isn't me steps through that frame, you pull the trigger until it stops clicking. Do you understand?" Esther's fingers closed around the grip. Her knuckles turned white, and the trembling in her hands began to subside, replaced by a cold, numbing resolve. She wasn't a waitress's punchline anymore. She wasn't a beggar asking for soup. She was the last line of defense for the life she had brought into the world. "I understand," she said, her voice dropping into a register he hadn't heard before, quiet, flat, and dangerous. LinHu nodded once, a brief acknowledgement of her transformation. He stood up and stepped back into the hallway, the silhouette of a man ready to meet a storm. As the panic room door finally hissed shut and the locks engaged with a heavy, final thud, Esther sat in the darkness, her back against the reinforced steel, the gun held firmly in both hands. The mother who had begged for leftovers was gone, in her place was a woman waiting in the shadows, ready to kill to keep her daughter safe. The silence was shattered not by a scream, but by the violent, percussive boom of the elevator doors being blown off their tracks. White smoke and dust billowed into the pristine penthouse, and before the debris could even settle, the first of the intruders surged forward. They were silhouettes of tactical gear and silenced muzzles, moving with a lethal, mechanical precision that LinHu had taught them. LinHu didn't give them a chance to find their footing. From behind the marble island, he opened fire. The rhythmic, guttural roar of his weapon filled the room, turning the air into a storm of hot brass and pulverized stone. The first 2 men fell instantly, their bodies sliding across the polished floor, but more were already pouring through the breach. The siege of apartment 12 had begun. For the next 17 minutes, the world was reduced to the smell of cordite and the strobe light flashes of gunfire. LinHu moved through the apartment like a ghost of his former self, a shadow that struck and vanished. He used the luxury furniture as cover, shredding designer sofas and shattering crystal vases into a million diamond-like shards. He was a man possessed, fighting not for territory or pride, but for the silence behind the library door. One of Kang's enforcers managed to flank the kitchen, his shadow falling across the very spot where Zion's cake still sat. LinHu lunged over the counter, his knife flashed silver in the red emergency light. The struggle was brief and brutal, a desperate scramble for air and life amidst the wreckage of a birthday party. LinHu rose from the floor, his shirt torn and crimson-stained, just as the hallway door was kicked inward. A heavy, muffled thud echoed from the panic room, the sound of Esther firing the first shot of her life. The intruders had reached the library. LinHu felt a surge of cold, white-hot adrenaline. He threw his empty submachine gun aside and drew his final magazine, his movements a blur of desperate efficiency. He met the remaining attackers in the narrow hallway. It was no longer a gunfight, it was a slaughter. He fought with the ferocity of a man who had already died once and refused to let a child share his fate. When the final intruder collapsed, the silence that rushed back into the room was deafening. The air was thick with gray smoke, swirling around the flickering remains of the 8 birthday candles that had somehow survived the chaos. LinHu stood in the center of the ruin, his chest heaving, his knuckles split and bleeding. He turned toward the library door, his voice a hoarse, jagged rasp. "Esther," he called out, the name sounding strange in the hollow silence. "It's over. Open the door." The mechanical hiss of the panic room door felt like the first breath of air after a long submersion. As the steel slid back, Esther stepped into the light, her face streaked with dust and sweat, the pistol still gripped with a white-knuckled intensity. She looked at the carnage in the hallway, the shattered glass, the spent casings, and the man standing amidst it all. LinHu was bleeding from a shallow cut on his temple, his suit jacket discarded, his white shirt stained with the soot of battle. He looked like a monster that had crawled out of a nightmare, yet to Esther, he was the only sanctuary left in the world. Zion emerged from behind her mother, her small hand clutching the hem of Esther's jacket. She looked at the ruined apartment, her eyes wide, but when they landed on LinHu, the fear didn't settle there. She saw the man who had given her the golden soup and the 8 candles. LinHu sank to one knee, ignoring the pain in his side. He didn't speak with the voice of a boss or a warlord. He looked at the little girl in the yellow dress, now smudged with the debris of a war she was never meant to see. "I'm sorry about the cake, Zion," he said, his voice cracking with a raw, human exhaustion. "I'll get you a new one. A bigger one." 1 year later, the Dragon's Reach was no longer a fortress of shadows. It was a home. The heavy stone counters now held coloring books and school bags instead of weapon crates. LinHu had spent that year systematically dismantling the Black Viper Syndicate, not for profit or territory, but to ensure that the city was quiet enough for a child to sleep soundly. He had traded his empire of fear for a legacy of protection. He sat at the kitchen table, watching as Esther, now radiant, the hollows of her eyes filled with life, placed a steaming bowl of homemade soup in front of Zion. It wasn't leftovers or scraps from a stranger's table. It was a recipe passed down through a family that was being built from the wreckage of their pasts. LinHu reached out, his hand, scarred from the siege, resting gently over Esther's. He had spent his life believing that power was a shield against the world, but as he watched Zion laugh and reach for a piece of fresh bread, he realized the truth. Real power wasn't the ability to take, it was the strength to provide. He looked at the two lives he had claimed as his own and realized his hunger had finally been satisfied. In the quiet warmth of the apartment, the man who had once been a ghost of the streets finally stepped into the light. He was no longer just a boss, he was a guardian, and as long as he drew breath, Zion would never have to ask for a scrap of anything ever again.